forward to being able to hear about what's on your mind, to hear about the issues that you are concerned about, answer the questions that you have. But I want to start with, I think, what is at the heart of so many of these challenges that we face. There is a corruption of spirit that is casting a dark shadow over our country, that is being driven by self-serving politicians, by special interests and greedy corporations, people in positions of power and influence in this country who are working for their own selfish interests, making changes, enacting policies, tearing us apart as a country, resulting in far too many people suffering. A situation where the vision that our founders had for this country, of a government of, by, and for the people, has been lost. How many of you feel that you are represented by a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? What's happening in Washington, the daily conversations that are occurring there, the decisions that are being made there are so disconnected. They are so far away from the reality that we are living in our everyday lives, all across this country. Challenges that our friends and families and loved ones are facing. The obstacles that exist, that stand in our way and stand in our path of moving forward, of finding real solutions to so many of the problems that we face. As we look through these different issues, we come back to this same core problem of people who are putting their own selfish interests ahead of the interests of the people. And so I know this is why we're gathered here. This is why you are giving up some of your precious time, because we care about each other. We care about our future. And we know that we are the key to bringing about the kind of change that we need to see. We are the key to bringing about that change in our leadership that fulfills that vision for our country that our founders had. Having leaders who are putting service above self, who understand that their sole purpose should be putting our interests first, putting the well-being of the people and our planet at the forefront of the decisions that are being made. So even during these times that are filled with frustration and heartache at how much our country is being torn apart, we should have cause for hope. I do, as I look around this room, as I have the privilege and opportunity to meet and to hear from so many people from all different parts of this country who are ready to stand up, to stand united. All of us coming from different backgrounds, different parts of the country, different races, religions, ethnicities, orientations, all standing together and united as Americans, motivated by this care for each other. Because we know that when we do this, when we stand united, not only will we begin to heal the deep divisions that we are seeing in this country, we know that there is no obstacle we cannot overcome. When we use the power that we find in our voices, through our votes, raising our voices and raising these issues, bringing this message to the forefront of service before self and how we can come together as Americans in this country to solve the systemic problems that we face. This is the only way that we can bring about that kind of major change that we need to see. Now, we may have different ideas on how to make that change. We may have different ideas on how to accomplish our goals, but we shouldn't be afraid of that diversity. We should encourage it. Have these debates. Sometimes they will be passionate and strong debates, but keeping at the forefront our focus and our mission, our unity as Americans in this country who want nothing more than to take care of each other and to leave behind a bright and strong future for our kids and their kids and generations to come. It is that focus on our common purpose that will enable us to bring about this change. This is the kind of change that I am seeking to lead. This is why I'm running for president, because because I know that when we do this, we can bring about the passage of legislation and real reforms to our healthcare system, for example. We can pass legislation like Medicare for all to make sure that every single person in this country who is in need of care is able to get that care. That we are not leaving people behind who are sick, but who may not be able to afford to get the care they need. We stand here today together because we know that it is unacceptable in this country where we pay, each of us, we pay far more for health care than any other country in the world, and yet we see far worse outcomes. It is unacceptable that we still today have millions of people in this country who are uninsured, or those who may be insured with some kind of coverage, but who still can't get the care they need because of high deductibles and high copays. So we end up in the place where we are, where our ability to get the care we need is dependent on how much money is in our pocket. That's not right. We know that when we stand together, we can bring about real criminal justice reform. We can end this for-profit private prison industry that is making money off of keeping people in prison, rather than seeking to see how do we end these high recidivism rates? How do we actually help people who are dealing with substance abuse and addiction, nonviolent drug offenders, to begin that path forward to recovery, rather than tearing families apart and ruining people's lives because of our failed war on drugs? It is when we stand together that we can do things like finally ending the federal marijuana prohibition that could have such a strong impact on so many levels in our country. New Hampshire is on the front lines of this opioid epidemic that is devastating people's lives, taking people's lives. By ending this marijuana prohibition, we can see the kind of progress that we've already seen in some states that have legalized some form of medical marijuana, where there has been a direct correlation and a drastic reduction of opioid addiction, and a direct correlation and a reduction of opioid-related deaths. See how friends of mine who are veterans, who have gone and served oftentimes in multiple combat deployments, come home dealing with post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury or chronic pain because of their combat-related injuries, but who, when they go and seek that care at the VA, because of this federal prohibition on marijuana, the only option they are given are these addictive opioids. And even when they say, no, I don't want these drugs, our VA doctors are not legally allowed to either prescribe or refer them to go to a medical marijuana dispensary, even in states that it's legal. There are so many different examples that we can cite about our broken criminal justice system. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that affects so many of our families. Let's talk a little bit about the climate crisis that we're facing. Again, not a partisan issue. This is one that affects our ability to live and the future for ourselves, our families, our kids, and their kids. This is something that deals with our ability to have clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, and a safe place to live. Coming from an island state in Hawaii, this is something that hits close to home for us, where folks their homes are literally being eroded because of the rising sea levels. They don't know where they're going to be able to go. We have to take bold, aggressive action to protect our planet, to protect our environment, to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and make an investment, a big investment for our generation and the next generation to come towards a green, renewable economy. We need to re-look at and reform our agriculture in this country, where every 5 years the federal government passes a big farm bill that offers a lot of subsidies towards a lot of multinational big agribusiness companies who are really only looking out for their profits and whose practices are poisoning our people with companies like Monsanto, now Bayer, as well as poisoning our soil. The These outdated agriculture practices are one of the biggest contributors to putting carbon into our atmosphere and escalating this climate crisis that we're facing. We've got to make these investments in our infrastructure, in education, making sure our teachers have the tools that they need and are being paid to set our kids up for success. That's worth a round of applause. My father-in-law is a public high school teacher in Hawaii. We've got a lot of teachers all over this country who are working very hard to set our kids up for success, set us up for success, but who do so with too little pay, spending what little they're making on buying school supplies for these kids, too often in overcrowded classrooms, and not having the tools that they need. These are the priorities that we need to be putting at the forefront in this country.
Hear, hear.
But instead we're seeing a couple of things. One is too many politicians who are putting power and profit ahead of our interests, ahead of the interests of the people. We see how little this issue that is central to the rest is addressed, and that issue is the cost of war. But as we talk about the need to make these big investments, these urgent and necessary investments to serve the needs of every single person in this country, too often you have self-serving politicians in Washington telling us there's just not enough money. There's just not enough money to make sure that every one of us has clean water to drink, to make sure that our infrastructure system is safe, that we're investing in renewable energy that will serve us and generation to come. There's just not enough money, but you know what? These are oftentimes the same politicians who are perpetuating and continually beating their war drums to continue these wasteful regime change wars that take trillions of dollars out of our pockets, that increase the suffering of the people in the countries where we wage these wars, that undermine our national security by strengthening terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and that takes such a toll on our service members, on our veterans. This is not an issue of the past. This is an issue that is central to every other issue that we're facing. In just a couple of weeks, on March 31st actually, the unit that I deployed with during my second deployment, the Hawaii Army National Guard, is deploying again. It's a unit of a little over 300 soldiers, and this time they're going to Afghanistan, a country where our troops are still being killed. For what?
No good reason.
To accomplish what objective? So I'm grateful. I'm going to have the chance to go back and be in Hawaii for probably less than 18 hours, but I get to go and visit with them and to give them a hug before they load up on that plane at Hickam Air Force Base. This is not a game. This cost of war is real. Many of the people who are deploying to Afghanistan are people who I served with, people who stood shoulder to shoulder as we served in Iraq in 2005 and saw some of our friends lose their lives, pay that ultimate price. We stood shoulder to shoulder when those first casualties occurred, paying tribute to our friend in front of those empty boots and that helmet that sat atop his rifle. Hearing his first sergeant call out the names of every soldier in their unit. Hearing them respond, saying, "Here, First Sergeant," until he came to our friend who was no longer there. And at his call, there was silence. This cost of war is real, and it continues to take a toll on all of us. Our service members and our troops continue to pay the price. amazing people in this country who raised their hands and said, because I love my country, I'm willing to put my life on the line for her, for all of us. And yet too often they are dishonored by continuously being sent on missions that are not worthy of their great sacrifice, missions that do not serve the interests of our country, missions that do not make us more safe and secure as a country, missions that ultimately serve interests other than our own, or interests other than the well-being of the people in the countries where we wage these wars. This cost of war is real for our veterans who come home, survive combat, multiple deployments, struggle with both visible and invisible wounds of war, with too many of them losing those battles here at home and taking their own lives. There is so much more that must be done to address this cost of war. Make sure that our veterans get the care and services that they need. And most importantly, let's stop sending them on these missions. Let's stop asking them to go and fight in these wasteful regime change wars that are counterproductive on every single level. We're in a situation now where not only do we need to end these wasteful regime change wars, but we are now facing a new Cold War with increasing tensions between our country, other nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China. A nuclear arms race. It's been kicked off with President Trump withdrawing from this historic INF treaty, negotiated 30 years ago by Reagan and Gorbachev, that at that time made such a huge impact in reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons in the world, of de-escalating these tensions, of reducing this risk of nuclear catastrophe. And yet, as we see with the budget that President Trump put forward just a couple of weeks ago, he is proposing slashing and cutting funds for education, for healthcare, for research, for food stamps, while wanting to spend more of our taxpayer dollars on building these nuclear weapons that make us less safe and make the world less safe. So this is a wake-up call for all of us about the reality of the threat that we're facing. It was a wake-up call that we were reminded of about a year ago in Hawaii, when early on a Saturday morning, there was a text alert that Civil Defense sent out to every cell phone across the state. Over 1 million people's phones started buzzing and making noise that read, "Missile incoming, seek shelter immediately. This is not a drill." Let that sink in for a moment and ask you to think about how you would feel and what would run through your mind if we got that message as we're here today on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. That just as people in Hawaii were waking up and thinking about, hey, let's go to the beach today, let's clean the house, let's do what we gotta do this Saturday morning, all of a sudden, they got this message that basically said, you have just minutes to live. What do you do? Where do you go? There's no nuclear bomb shelters or bunkers. Do you have any here? No.
Walmart.
I wouldn't count on that. But that's what people did, though. I mean, we had people running through the streets, kids on college campuses sprinting across campus trying to find a building or a shelter or some place that they thought they might be able to be safe. We had a father who lowered his little girl, who was probably about 7 years old, down a manhole, thinking that that may be the only place she may be protected. I heard from another father after this was done saying how he was trying to figure out, with one child on one side of the island and another child on the other side of the island, which one he would drive to spend the last minutes of his life with. this alarm turned out to be false, but the reason we reacted in the way that we did, terrified, afraid, was because this threat is real. It's not just real for the people in Hawaii, it's real for every one of us in this country. Why? Why is this the reality that we're facing? It's because our leaders have failed us, that have brought us to this point. But I talk about this because it's important for us to recognize that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. I'm running for president because I don't want any one of you or your families or your loved ones and your friends to have to go through what we went through. We must stand up. We must stand together to bend this arc of history away from war and towards peace. Knowing that we are taking on powerful forces who unfortunately have benefited from these continued wasteful regime change wars, from this escalation of this nuclear arms race. We also must know that when we stand together, there is no obstacle we cannot overcome. There is so much at stake, both with our existence and our future, and the money that is coming out of our pockets, going to pay for these wars and these weapons, dollars that we need to bring back to serve our needs, to make sure that we've got health care, education, and strong infrastructure, that we are using those precious resources to rebuild a future that is bright, that provides for opportunity and justice and equality for every American. This is why I'm here. This is why I'm asking for your support, why I'm asking for you to stand shoulder to shoulder with me to build this movement for peace. Peace here at home, peace abroad, as we join hands in working together towards that bright future for everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
So I noticed in your Twitter profile that you're a surfer.
Yes, sir.
And I'm a surfer as well. Maybe could you just give a couple of moments about how that shaped you as a person and perhaps as a candidate?
Will you take us surfing?
Yeah, we're going to go to Rye Beach together.
Awesome. Awesome. I might have to borrow a wetsuit or two. Thank you for asking that. You know, growing up in Hawaii, I'm so grateful on so many levels, but the ocean was our playground. When I first learned how to swim, it was in the ocean, it was in the water. And the love and appreciation that I developed from a young age for protecting our environment, protecting our planet and resources didn't come because someone taught it to me or told me, hey, this is something you should care about. It's because I wanted to take care of our home. So some of the first things that I started to do and where I experienced that I was most happy when I was doing things for other people was just getting friends of mine together and saying, hey, there's a bunch of trash on the beach. Let's go and clean it up. That's what originally sparked my interest and my drive and motivation to constantly try to find ways that I could do more to accomplish that goal, to keep our water clean, to make sure that our oceans and our marine life are protected, to make sure that these beautiful places that we get to call home are preserved for us and for generations to come. I first, this is why I first ran for office. I was 21 years old. And a lot of folks at that time said, you're crazy for running for office at 21. I think you all have some state reps here who are younger than 21. So kudos, 19 years old. But I wanted to do more. And these issues of protecting our oceans, protecting our planet was what drove me. And at a deeply personal level, I try to get into the ocean as much as possible. Because it's magic, man. It's magic. It's hard to describe. refreshing, the renewal that you get from being in the ocean. I would say this is across Mother Nature. When we can't go surfing in Hawaii, we try to go snowboarding out here. It just keeps us centered and connected to our planet and why this is so important to us. I know I'm rambling on a little bit, but one of the things that I really enjoy doing in Hawaii is every now and then we have the chance to go and bring veterans and folks who have been severely wounded in combat out to the ocean. There's a nonprofit called Access Surf where both for veterans as well as those who are disabled, bring them out in the water, getting them on a surfboard, helping them along if they've never surfed, but seeing how rejuvenating that is for them, and how folks who have been through the worst of experiences, the smile on their face and that sheer joy that brings you back to, you know, the insane laughter and giggles that you had when you were 5 years old, seeing that in people's faces is really incredible. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much first for your service in the military and in Congress. I appreciate the time you've devoted. The message of peace, I love it, but here in New Hampshire, we have a lot of people who have guns, and they're going to have the knee-jerk reaction of you're coming for our guns. What do you have to say to them?
Just as we stand in protection of and upholding our Constitution, our First Amendment and our freedom of speech, we also need to protect and uphold our Second Amendment and people's right to bear arms. We also have a responsibility to make sure that we have sensible gun safety laws in place so that those who seek to do harm to others with those guns are not able to own them or to have them. We just passed in Congress legislation that would provide universal background checks. This is something that has the it was a bipartisan bill in Congress, and it has the support of the vast majority of people in this country. When I talk to most people about this, their response is, wait, this isn't already the law? So I think there's more that we can do, but as we approach this, we've got to get away from how this issue has been so politicized to people are reacting out of fear, rather than really looking at it from the safety perspective of our shared interests. We had a girl who we saw in Durham yesterday. She was 13 years old, and she asked about this issue and said, what can be done to make it so that I'm not afraid to go to school every day thinking that that might be the last day that I live? That's not something that should be running through any of our kids' minds or the minds of any parent in this country. I think there's a great example on how we can make progress in this area that is being put forth by a lot of the kids from Parkland in Florida, who saw firsthand that devastation, that massacre that took place at their school, and have decided to do something about it. And they're not just talking to people who agree with them. They're going to Democrat states and Republican states, going across the country, coming to Washington, meeting with both Democrats and Republicans, and just talking to them about their experiences and how we really have a shared interest around passing legislation and making common sense reforms that are really about safety and that don't violate people's Second Amendment rights. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Just a few comments. We need to work with Congressman Lynch and Congresswoman Gabbard to Gabbard, I mean.
Oh, okay.
To introduce and pass the Return to Prudent Banking Act.
We are working on that, actually.
And the Society of Civil Engineers says it would take about $8 trillion to get the infrastructure to where it needs to be, not to mention what we need for the future. So as well as the peace dividend, we have to get back to the National Bank and use credit to rebuild this country. as far as the Green New Deal goes, we have to head more towards fusion energy and crash course in that. Because wind and solar is not going to power up the high-speed trains that they're talking about.
Thank you. Well, you raise a number of very important issues that we are focused on building actionable plans to address and making those bold investments to do so. The first bill that you talked about, the Return to Prudent Banking Act, refers to Wall Street reform. For those of you who don't know, refers to Wall Street reform and reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act. This is again a bill that we have seen and something we've got to continue to push to the forefront. We visited a supporter of ours here in Rochester, and we went and stopped by his house for a few minutes before coming here. And he lives in a neighborhood that is full of trailer homes. And he talked about how he lost his 4-bedroom, 2-bath, beautiful home with a swimming pool because of Wall Street banks' greedy actions and gambling with our lives and our futures. And he is still trying to dig his life and his family's lives out of the mess that was created because of their actions and their decisions. Wall Street banks are bigger and more powerful today than they ever were before when we were told they were too big to fail. So even with the regulations and restrictions that have been passed in the Dodd-Frank Act, it was not nearly enough to get to where we need to be to reduce this risk that we continue to face by these banks that are still too big to fail.
A lot of the corruption that you spoke about earlier is money-driven.
Yes.
In many of the opinions. And what specific reforms do you think that you would be able to put into place fairly on a short, not waiting for years and years, but on a, within a year or something, some sort of reform that could kind of get rid of some of that corruption of money in politics that exists today?
Thank you for your question. You're exactly right. As we look through all of these different issues, as you mentioned, healthcare, criminal justice reform, our prisons, the defense industry, education, infrastructure, across the board, we see the root cause of the problem and why these problems haven't been solved is because of this influence of big special interest money in our politics. It infects every single part of our lives. We've got to do more in this country to continue to try to overturn Citizens United. This is not legislation to do this, but there are simultaneous efforts occurring from the grassroots level in states across the country to bring about some form of a constitutional amendment to address Citizens United and the dark money that is being used to influence our elections. We need to stop PACs and lobbyists from contributing to our elected officials, really buying their way in to have a seat at the table to write laws that impact all of us. Your question speaks to how can we do, where's the low-hanging fruit? How can we get some things done quickly? I want to be clear-eyed, as we all should be, about how deep this corruption goes and how it's not going to be very easy. How important it is for all of us to hold our own leaders accountable. If your elected officials have not already said, hey, look, I won't take any PAC or lobbyist money, urge them to do so. They're accountable to us. They're accountable to you. Another, I think, important action that we need to take is to close the revolving door that has created this swamp that Donald Trump talks about in Washington, that he has turned into a cesspool by appointing people to things like the Department of Interior who come from the oil industry, by people who he appoints to the Trade Commission and to other positions within our government who come from the industries, who have benefited and profited from those industries. We need to close this revolving door so that people who are in those positions as regulators to protect us as consumers are not people who are either representing these special interest groups or industries or we're personally benefiting from them. There are far too many examples to cite, but some that we're seeing the current effects of. I mentioned the Department of Interior. We've seen with the Environmental Protection Agency under this administration how people appointed to lead the agency whose lives and careers have been centered around ruining our environment rather than protecting it. You see the current chair of the FCC, Ajit Pai, who one of the first things that he did was repeal net neutrality, really without disclosing the fact that he just came from working for Verizon, one of the corporations that would benefit from repealing net neutrality. And we see this happening on Wall Street, where you have regulators appointed to the SEC who are coming from Wall Street and then later going back to Wall Street. And you wonder why we don't have these protections built in. We see this in the defense industry, where there are people who work in the Pentagon who are writing contracts, multi-million or billion-dollar contracts with defense contractors, who will write those contracts one day, leave that job, and then go and work for the very contractor that they wrote that contract for. We've got to close this revolving door. We're working on legislation right now and an actionable plan that would do just that. So there are multi-facets here. Obviously, campaign finance reform is another big one. But again, we shouldn't be naive to the power that this money holds over far too many of our elected leaders and non-elected leaders, for that matter. So it's going to require a concerted effort to be able to remove that corruptive influence from our leaders. Just to put a final note on that, our campaign is completely powered by people. We take no PAC money and no lobbying.
Regime change. How did we get there? How did we get to that place where that's a habit? And how do we unravel that and reverse it?
So often throughout decades of our country's history, we have seen how U.S.-led regime change has often been sold to the American people under the guise of humanitarianism, saying, well, we need to go in and topple this dictator or that dictator or government that we don't like to help the people in these countries who are suffering horribly. But in fact, time and time again, we see that those motives are not they're not good at all. And they really don't have the interests of our people or the people in these countries at heart. And we see this because these actions have both short and long-term implications in increasing the suffering of people in these countries and making their lives far worse off than they were before. Going back to my home state of Hawaii, where the Queen and the monarchy was overthrown by the U.S. government illegally. She was thrown in jail. What was behind that? It was these wealthy plantation owners who wanted to come and grow their crops in Hawaii, and the Queen, she wasn't buying what they were selling. We see how in Central and South America, United Fruit Company influenced our leaders in the Department of Defense to go in and to take out those leaders who were not cooperating or giving them the deal that they were looking for to grow their bananas or sugarcane. They didn't want that competition that was being provided to them by these other countries. We see it, of course, in the Middle East, oil. We see how this administration right now really isn't even trying to hide the fact that they're advocating for U.S. intervention. They're actually intervening, taking actions to intervene in Venezuela, is because they're trying to get access for American oil companies into those resources that belong to the Venezuelan people. To your point, what is behind all of this?
Dark money?
You look at these corporate interests who have influence over leaders in our government to do their bidding. You have the military-industrial complex that has great influence over these very same leaders. And then you have situations and the hypocrisy that exists where they say, well, we need to go and help people in this country because of all of these human rights violations, while at the same time cozying up to countries like Saudi Arabia and actually illegally using our U.S. military and our taxpayer dollars to help Saudi Arabia wage its genocidal war in Yemen. dropping bombs on school buses, on weddings, on markets, killing tens of thousands of Yemeni civilians. Saudi Arabia has a blockade that is blocking food and medicine, water from coming, causing the worst humanitarian crisis of a generation, with millions of Yemeni people in need of, dire need of humanitarian aid. And all of this is happening knowing, it's been reported publicly on CNN, knowing that Saudi Arabia is both directly and indirectly providing U.S. arms and weapons to Al-Qaeda, the very same terrorist group that attacked us on 9/11, the very same terrorist group that we have troops deployed to different countries in the world trying to defeat. So this hypocrisy in our leadership is what must end. And we change this. Strong leadership. This requires leadership that will not bend to the whims and the wishes of these corporate interests, of the military-industrial complex, of the foreign policy establishment in Washington that spans across both parties that have been behind perpetuating these wasteful regime change wars. I'm running for president not because I have ever had any ambition to play or be president, but because I seek to lead to bring about these changes. And I have the experience, the conviction, and the qualifications, given my service in the Army for almost 15 years, of being deployed twice in the Middle East, of seeing firsthand the cost of war and the high human price that is paid, of seeing firsthand while deployed that waste, fraud, and abuse of our taxpayer dollars going to then corporations like Halliburton. I'm not someone who's going to go and sit in the Oval Office and be intimidated by or bullied into taking positions by the foreign policy establishment or generals who I'm often asked, and some of you may be wondering, well, Tulsi, how do you stand out from this crowded Democratic primary? What is the difference between you and the rest of them? This is the difference. This experience that I bring, the people who we are speaking for and fighting for, is that difference. Where I know that I and we can bring about this sea change in our foreign policy that we desperately need to see by fulfilling that most important responsibility, that most important job that the President has as Commander-in-Chief.
About the Supreme Court,
Yes.
what's your thoughts on the idea of packing the court, adding people to the Supreme Court?
Increasing the numbers of
Yes.
justices. I think it doesn't get to the heart of the problem. Just by increasing the numbers doesn't deal with the fact that the court has become so politicized, where it has become a tool of the political parties to see how can we make sure that our guys or gals pack the court. So the problem that we're dealing with now with 9 is not going to go away by changing it to 12 or 15 or whatever number is being proposed. We've got to get to the root of this problem where as nominees are put forward to the Senate for confirmation, the lines are already drawn based on partisanship, based on politics. Without ever hearing from or meeting or looking at a history or a record of an individual who's being nominated, you've already got people on the other side who are attacking and saying no. Contrast that with, I think Justice Ginsburg talked about her confirmation. I think she had like 98 votes of support. That's what we've got to get back to, of making sure that the questions that we are asking and the standard that we are holding our nominees to is one of upholding our Constitution and putting our people first rather than one party's interests or the others.
So I just got the high sign from the campaign. We can't take any more questions right now. However, Tulsi will be around to chat with afterwards. after the media thing, but just a couple of things, Tulsi, before you leave the stage. Now, first thing is, Tulsi's voice, as you heard, is very important to get onto the debate stage. And the Democratic National Committee has set it up that they need X number of donations, 65 unique donations in order to make it.
65,000.
Yeah.
Add 3 zeros. Sorry.
That's all right. So if you really like what you hear and you want to hear Tulsi get on that debate stage, you can make a donation as small as $1 to the campaign, and that helps get her closer to being at that debate stage. So please. I have a little gift for you. This is a little something from the Rockingham Democratic Committee. We have a little saying here that the road to the White House goes through Rockingham County. You can't win the White House without winning Rockingham County. The road to the White House goes through Rockingham County.
Well, I'm glad I'm here. Thank you very much.
And you're the only one who's fallen for the invitation so far to come here.